Some wars have lasted for decades, but at least one didn't even last a full hour. Zanzibar was once an island country off the coast of Tanganyika and is today a part of Tanzania. Zanzibar Island has been under the control of the Sultans of Oman since they kicked out the Portuguese settlers in 1698. In 1858, Sultan Majid bin Said declared the island an independent nation, and the United Kingdom was quick to recognize it as such, leaving Oman not much say in the matter. But Britain's backing was a very calculated move. At the time, just off the coast lay German East Africa, a region of the continent under the control of the Germans. This was at the height of Europe's land grab in Africa, where major powers rushed in to install protectorates and create colonies to claim the lucrative riches of the continent. Zanzibar's location just off the coast of Tanganyika gave the British an excellent staging point from which to control valuable trade routes along the African east coast. In exchange for Britain's protection, Zanzibar gave the British the right to veto the appointment of any sultan to rule over the nation. This allowed the British Empire great control over Zanzibar and its people, something that many resented. On the morning of the 25th of August, 1896, the current sultan suddenly died. Many believe that he was actually murdered by his younger nephew, Khalid bin Bargash, who suddenly and unexpectedly moved into the palace complex and assumed the role of sultan, all without the British approval. This wasn't the first time the young Khalid had tried to claim power though, as a few years earlier after the death of Sultan Ali bin Said, he had tried to claim the throne for himself. The British, however, did not approve of the young would-be sultan and had warned him that the use of military force would happen if he attempted to take power. The warning had worked once, and it was expected a similar warning would work again. This time, though, Khalid ignored the warning. The young sultan gathered the palace bodyguard and his supporters in preparation of repelling a British attack. By the end of the day, 2,800 men armed with rifles and muskets, along with several Maxim machine guns, a single Gatling gun, one 17th century bronze cannon, and two 12-pounders had gathered at the palace. Rifles, cannons, and machine guns aimed at the British ships just offshore. The British responded by landing a force of 150 sailors and marines, as well as rallying a contingent of 900 Zanzibar Askaris. The loyalty of the Askaris was in question, though they would later prove themselves reliable and loyal to the British. Just offshore the palace, 5 Royal Navy ships had set up on station by the end of the day, all of them modern and capable of shore bombardment. The next day dawned with yet another request from the British that Khalid give up the throne, to which at 8:30 a.m. Khalid sent a messenger with the following reply: "We have no intention of hauling down our flag, and we do not believe you would open fire on us." The British sent their own reply immediately: "We do not want to open fire, but unless you do as you were told, we shall certainly do so." At 8:55, with no further reply from the Sultan, the Edgar-class protected cruiser St. George Rawson hoisted up the signal to prepare for action. All across the small fleet of 5 ships, crews raced to make their cannons ready. At 9 a.m. on the dot, the British unleashed hell. The ships began firing large, high-explosive and fragmentation shells into the mostly wooden palace. The damage was immediate, with one of the first shots obliterating one of the defenders' cannons and its crew. The volley of fire tore through palace walls and balconies, causing massive casualties amongst the 3,000 or so defenders, many of them slaves forced to stay behind by their owners to fight. Fire started almost immediately, and yet the British continued firing, pouring 500 shells, 4,100 machine gun rounds, and 1,000 rifle rounds into the palace grounds. At 9:05, a very brief naval engagement took place as the crew of a commandeered yacht, the Glasgow, began firing on the British ships with obsolete 9-pounder guns and a single Gatling gun, itself a gift from Queen Victoria to the past Sultan. The return fire almost immediately sunk the ship, and her crew was rescued by British sailors and skiffs. By about 9:40, the shelling was stopped. The palace was in flames by then, and 500 women and men lay dead. The Sultan, though, had fled the palace, with some sources indicating that he had fled even before the fighting had started. He and several of his supporters took shelter at the German consulate, where they were guarded by 10 German soldiers. The Germans refused to give the young would-be sultan up to the British, though, as their extradition treaty with the British Empire explicitly forbade giving up political prisoners. Instead, the consulate was placed under guard by British troops, and the sultan managed to avoid arrest by stepping directly from the consulate's garden into a waiting boat, therefore never officially re-entering the British-controlled Zanzibar. Young Khalid would remain in exile until the end of World War II, when the British captured and sent him into exile in the remote islands of the Seychelles and later St. Helena. The Zanzibar government, meanwhile, was forced to pay back the cost of the ammunition used by the British forces, as well as the cost of looting that occurred as a result of the fighting, amounting to about 300,000 rupees. This was far from the only surprising short war in history, and in 1969, a simple game of soccer led to a 100-hour war. By the end of the 60s, tensions between Honduras and El Salvador were sky high. Mass immigration from El Salvador to Honduras had led to 20% of Honduras's population being Salvadorian. Salvadorian, and a ratcheting up of tensions over ongoing immigration. To add fuel to the fire, though, the American-owned United Fruit Company owned a significant portion of the farmable land, leading to native Hondurans and immigrant Salvadorians struggling to compete with the massive fruit company. Using its massive influence, United Fruit pressured Honduran government into enacting land reforms which would protect the land rights of the wealthy and prevent the redistribution of farming land back to the people. This systemic inequality and economic exploitation, as well as rising tensions over immigration, proved to be a powder keg that only needed one single spark to ignite into a full-blown war. In June of 1969, the two neighboring countries met at the 1970 FIFA World Cup qualifier. The first game in the Honduran capital on June 8th led to fighting between fans of the opposing teams and ended with a Honduran victory of 1-0. On the 15th of June, a second game in the Salvadoran capital resulted in a win of 3-0 by El Salvador. Immediately, violence exploded across both countries as Salvadorians and Hondurans took to the streets. Before the third and deciding match was played, El Salvador had cut off diplomatic ties with Honduras, citing nearly 12,000 Salvadorans that had been forced to flee back to El Salvador over violence with no response from the Honduran government. At the playoff match on June 27th, El Salvador would win 3-2 in extra time. War was inevitable. 2 weeks later, El Salvador declared war with a decisive first strike. The Salvadorian Air Force, lacking much in heavy equipment, innovated by strapping explosives to the side of passenger planes, which were then dropped with great effect on several Honduran targets. This included Toncontín International Airport, which was left damaged enough that the Honduran Air Force was unable to respond. Along the border, the Salvadoran army launched two major offensives into Honduras along its two main roads that connected the countries. Spearheaded by a well-equipped mechanized division and heavy fire support in the form of towed artillery, the Salvadoran thrust penetrated deep, reaching to within striking distance of the Honduran capital. However, the Honduran Air Force, which had been caught off guard, quickly went on its own offensive. Incredibly, both sides were still flying World War II-era piston-engine aircraft, resulting in the last piston-engine dogfights in history. Honduran planes struck deep into El Salvador, crippling its fuel production and strafing ground troops. The Honduran army, with aid from Nicaragua in the form of weapons and ammunition, managed to set up a defense of the routes leading to the capital, stopping the Salvadorans in their tracks. Honduras, however, did not believe it could hold out against the Salvadoran army, and it pressed the Organization of American States and the USA to pressure El Salvador into ceasefire. El Salvador initially refused, claiming that they would not withdraw their troops until Honduras paid reparations for the victimized Salvadorans forced to flee their homes in Honduras and protect the massive Salvadoran population within its borders from any further violence. After 100 hours of fighting, a ceasefire was eventually signed, but El Salvador would refuse to withdraw its troops until early into August. The war would result in vast economic damage for both countries. El Salvador suffered 900 dead, mostly civilians from Honduran air raids, while Honduras lost 250 combat troops and 2,000 civilians killed in the fighting. The fighting disrupted economic activity across the region and greatly impacted the economies of both nations, resulting in grinding poverty that would last for years. However, few suffered more than the 300,000 Salvadorans displaced from Honduras, who returned to their home nation only to find the government unwelcoming. With no government support and few jobs, the refugees would be forced to fend for themselves. Inevitably, the underlying social issues in El Salvador would lead to the Salvadoran Civil War 10 years later. Our next shortest war would be one of the most stunning victories in the history of modern warfare, and perhaps most fittingly was a true-to-life David versus Goliath engagement that shook the world. In 1967, Israel was surrounded by enemies. Previous wars had seen its Arab neighbors and their protectors attempt to destroy the fledgling nation, and yet incredibly each time tiny Israel had managed to not just hold off the attackers, but inflict devastating counterattacks that humiliated its opponents. As the 60s drew to a close, the Arab world buzzed with anger at Israel, and the pounding of drums of war was obvious to all. Syria, in cooperation with its Arab allies, had been attempting to divert the Jordan River for years, which would have deprived Israel of a major source of water. Each attempt resulted in Israeli forces shelling the attempted diversions, or if out of range, sending air power to bomb it. It was clear to all that continuing attempts to divert the Jordan would result in all-out war with Israel. To make matters worse, Syria was sheltering Palestinian terrorists that routinely carried out attacks against Israeli civilians. A new war was inevitable, and the United States' assessment of the situation judged that Israel would be militarily unchallengeable by any combination of Arab states, at least during the next 5 years. A British defense attaché noted that in command, training, equipment, and services, the Israeli army is more prepared for war than ever before. Well-trained, tough, self-reliant, the Israeli soldier has a strong fighting spirit and would willingly go to war in defense of his country. Despite these assessments, though, Israel was still a tiny nation, and with nearly the entirety of the Arab world against it, it could easily be swallowed up in a prolonged campaign. Thus, as border skirmishes intensified, Israel knew how to press its advantages immediately and launched one of the most stunning first strikes conflicts in the history of war. By summer of 1967, the forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan had begun to mobilize. Israel's biggest problem was Egypt, which had a far more capable army and air force than its allies. Thus, on the morning of June 5th, Israel launched a massive preemptive strike against Egypt, catching the country completely unaware. Israeli fighter bombers destroyed dozens of Egyptian aircraft on the ground and cratered Egyptian runways. By the end of the day, 90% of Egypt's air force was in flames. Simultaneously, Israel launched a massive airstrike against the Syrian air force, achieving similar success. This now left the Israeli military with complete air superiority, and it used it to full advantage. Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian armored forces, though vastly superior in number, were decimated from the skies or destroyed by superior Israeli tanks and their expert tank crews. After 6 days of fighting, Israel's attack resulted with its seizure of the Gaza Strip, the entire Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank of Jordan, and the Golan Heights. This placed Israeli troops in the strategically important Golan Heights and the bank of the Suez Canal, from where they would be difficult if not impossible to remove in further fighting. One by one, the Arab allies accepted a ceasefire. The war would only stoke resentment amongst the region's Arab populations, though, and set the stage for their own brilliant defeats of Israeli forces in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Now go check out how to actually win at war, or click this other video instead.